Once you've cut out all of your designs that you plan to add to your character, you're ready to begin sewing. In your kit, you were given a sewing needle, which looks like a straight pin, except it has a little loop on the end instead of that flat nail top, and a spool of thread. If you have other thread at home and you want to use different colors, you can, or you can use what came with your kit. So I have 2 spools of thread, so I'm going to be switching back and forth just to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see color. I don't want to be stitching these pieces with the same color thread because then you won't be able to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to be using this kind of tie-dye color thread and this green. So when we begin working on our design, it's very important that you kind of figure out where you want everything to be before you begin sewing. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to sew all of the flat pieces that are going to sit on the character and not hang over the sides. So my little butterfly that I added to the top here, this is going to wait for later. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that to the little bag of pieces and parts that I don't want to lose, so I don't accidentally throw that out. The pot that I plan on putting on is also going to be something that I'm going to add on after because it extends beyond the body of the character, so I'm not going to worry about this just yet. The only thing that I do want to kind of keep in mind is when I'm putting my character's pieces on, I want to make sure that they're going to line up correctly here. If I put a flower all the way down on the bottom, you wouldn't have seen it when I added the pot. So you just want to make sure that everything looks good where it lined up, that you're happy with your design, and that you're double checking before you start sewing everything on that you're sewing to the correct side. So again, remember my big arm is on the left on this side and on the right on this side. So I know when I put them together, the blank insides will be touching and all the designs that I worked so hard on will be on the outside and visible. So I'm going to take my design and slide it off to the side of my workspace so that I've got room and I know I'm not going to mess with these little pieces. I'm just going to kind of slide them there on my desk off camera. Now what I'm going to work on today is sewing on these little pieces here. And the stitch that we are going to be using today is called a running stitch. So a running stitch begins just like any other sewing stitch with threading the needle. So I'm going to be using a scrap piece of felt to show you the design on today of how to work on a running stitch, and then I'll show you how to use it on your character. If you would like to attempt to, sew and practice on one of the pieces of scrap felt that you're not using before you begin sewing on your character, that's perfectly fine. So I'm going to remove my sewing needle from this little piece of paper, and I don't want to lose this because this kind of helps me again keep track of where my sharp things are. And it is going to help when you go to return your materials for me to be able to find your sewing needle in your bag. You were also given a spool of thread. Some of the thread has already been started, and some of it, if you can't find an end tucked around the outside, sometimes if you just kind of rub it, it'll come up. Sometimes if it's a brand new piece, it'll be wedged in the top along the ridge here. So just kind of look for the end of your thread and locate that. When we sew, we're sewing on small pieces, so we're going to begin with just 1 arm's length of thread. So I'm holding the thread in my hand and I'm going to stretch the thread up to my shoulder and cut. You do not want to try and sew with a wingspan. That's a popular length that we've been working in for yarn. If you try to work with too much thread at once because it's so small and thin, it tends to get tangled up and it's really hard to work with. So 1 arm's length from your fingertip up to your neck and cut. So I've just kind of doubled mine back here so that you can see it all on camera. So I'm working with a short piece of thread. Your sewing needle has a loop in the bottom in the top of the needle. And you're going to be trying to get the end of your thread through that loop. So you want to make sure that you have a nice, fresh, clean edge with your thread. Sometimes if you weren't good at cutting it, or the person before you might have, left you something that was a little bit of a mess, you might have, kind of a fuzzy end on there. And that just makes it a little harder to thread your needle. So make sure you have a nice, clean cut end to start with. Now, you may have seen people sew before, lick the end of their thread. We don't do that in crafts class because we handle each other's projects and we don't want to touch a project that's been licked a bunch of times. It's certainly not sanitary. So I'm going to show you a trick for threading your needle that does not involve licking the end of your thread. So you're going to take your end and you're going to hold it between your thumb and your pointer finger so that just the tiniest little dot of color is barely visible. So you might be able to just barely see that little tiny dot of green between my fingers. I'm then going to take my needle and push it onto the thread. So I'm just going to take my needle, line it up between my fingers, and slowly push down, and the thread will go right into the hole. So it's going to pick the path of least resistance. It's easier to go through the hole than it is to fight to go around it. So it's going to go straight through the middle there. If you're trying to put the thread in the needle like this, it's very hard, because if you miss it by just the tiniest little bit, the thread just kind of goes to one side or the other. So it's always going to be easier to hold the thread so that there's barely anything visible, and then push the needle onto the thread instead of trying to put the thread in the needle. When we sew with thread, because it is so thin, we double up on the thread. So I've taken that end that I just threaded through the needle, and this is called the eye of the needle, and I'm going to bring it all the way back down and match it up with the other end. So my thread is double. That means I'm sewing with two pieces. This is different than what we were doing with the yarn. You're going to tie a knot in the end of these two pieces of thread, and you want it to be a good, messy knot. If you sit and painstakingly try to tie a nice, neat little knot, one of the things that you'll notice about felt is it's very porous, meaning these little gaps in between it are very big, and there's a very good chance that a little teeny tiny knot will pull right through. And we want a nice big stopper knot that's going to keep this thread from pulling through to the other side. So I'm going to show you a trick my great grandmother taught me when she taught me how to sew. So you're going to start off by grabbing the two ends of the thread between your middle finger and your thumb, and you'll get faster at this as you go. And I'm going to go up and over my pointer finger, keeping my hands close together. I don't want to be holding it all the way down here and wrapping it around my finger. You want to keep your pointer finger close to the action. So I'm holding those two little ends with my middle finger and my thumb, and I'm wrapping the rest of the thread around my pointer finger, so it's making a little X right on top of my pointer finger before the crease bend in my finger. I'm going to let go of the tail with my thumb, and I'm going to move my thumb up to that X. Now I'm going to take the pressure off the tail. That's very important. And I'm going to let go of this little tail here. And I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to roll my pointer finger back down my thumb and see how everything's getting kind of tangled. And again, I'm not putting pressure on this long tail. And it makes this kind of tangly mess. Once you've got that tangly mess, you're going to pinch above it and pull hard and pull down. And it cinches that tangly mess into a big old knot. And that's exactly what we want for sewing on felt. So once again, I'm going to cut this off just to show you one more time. Take my two ends, hold them between my pointer finger and my thumb, wrap them around my pointer finger. Remember, don't keep pulling on the ends. You're going to move your thumb over, pinch, and you're going to rub it off in one smooth movement. You don't want to do this with your thumb because you're trying to make it get tangled. grab above, pinch and pull to make a big messy knot. And big messy knot is perfect because it's going to be on the inside of our character. So when we're all done, no one should be able to see it. So the running stitch begins with the big messy knot on the end of my doubled thread. And you're always going to start on the back of your character. So if I was starting on my little cactus guy over here, I would start on this side coming up. Now on my practice felt, there is no front and back, so I'm just going to designate this the back, the side that's facing down. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go up through the felt all the way until the knot hits the back. Now running stitch looks like a small dotted or dashed line. So I'm going to keep my stitches small. I'm going to go in about 1/8 of an inch away from it, and I'm going to go back down to the bottom side, and I'm going to pull all the way until there's no more thread left except for that little loop. Then I'm very carefully going to move over that same distance and leave a little gap there, come back up through the back and down through the front. So a running stitch, you want to keep your stitches small and evenly spaced out. You're always going to come up through the back and go down through the front. And it's going to make this little dashed line. Now you can see I'm kind of poking my needle through, and if it doesn't come through exactly where I want it, I'm just going to kind of pull it back until I get it where I want it before I pull it all the way through. And down. So you could think of it like a little swimmer. He jumps up out of the water and then dives back down into the water. Jumps up out of the water and then dives back down into the water. And done correctly, you should have a little dashed line when you're all done. One of the things that you want to be really careful about when you're working with your running stitch is going around the outside. So you're always going to be going, I'm going to flip mine around here, up through the back, down through the front. Think of a diver. He's swimming through the water, dives up and back down. If he was to dive up and jump outside of the pool, he can't get back underwater. If he does that, it creates this stitch that goes all the way around the outside, which is incorrect. If that happens to you, do not try and take your needle and push it back down through the felt, because the odds of you getting it right back in that tiny little hole are very, very slim. You can flip it over and just use your fingers. Remember, felt's kind of porous, so this sort of works for this material. And I'm just kind of pulling on the thread, and kind of, you see I'm moving my finger around in a circle. It allows the needle to find that hole, and I can just pull the needle out backwards, go back to the front where it's supposed to be, and then back down through the front. So up through the back, down through the front, and you want to keep your stitches small and close together and evenly spaced. So I'm showing you an example of what not to do now. So if your stitches are regular, you've got big, medium, small, smaller, bigger. This is not what we're going for. We want nice, evenly spaced stitches, even stitch, even space between, the best that you can. And you're going to continue to make those nice, even stitches all the way around till you get to the part where you're done sewing. Now, when we get to the end of our sewing, we need to tie off to anchor this piece of thread. You can't just cut this piece and continue sewing something else, because these pieces will eventually pull out. And you saw how easy it was for me to pull that piece of thread out. To anchor it down, I'm going to go underneath one of my loops from my stitches on the back. And it doesn't matter what loop you go under, just find one that's close to where you want to end to anchor it down. And I'm going to pull, let me just straighten this out so you can see this a little better. I'm going to pull almost all the way until I have just a small loop here. And you're going to take that and go your needle and go through the loop to tie a knot. And I like to tie 3 times. 2 makes a knot. 3 is just because I'm overly cautious, and sometimes I like to add an extra. And then once you've got that cut or that tied, then you can go ahead and cut off your thread. Now this little piece of thread is not long enough for me to sew with, so I'm going to pull it back out of my needle, throw it out, and get another piece to work with. So remember, hand to neck, get a nice clean cut. I'm going to thread my needle again, bring my ends back together, wrap them, pinch, roll, and tie. So you're going to use the running stitch, these small, evenly spaced dashed lines, to sew on all of the designs that you want on your character. So these are 2 different examples of the running stitch. This one using a different color thread where it's visible, and this one using a matching color thread so it's not as visible. So depending on what you have to work with, if you have more than one color of thread at home and you want to make stitches that stand out, you can do that. If you have matching colors and you want it to kind of blend in, you can do that as well. Now here you'll see that there are 2 different examples on this running stitch of directions for the running stitch to go. You can follow the shape and stay on top, or you can do this sort of radiating running stitch. And this is exactly the same stitch, it's just done in a slightly different direction. So I'm going to show you how to do both of those now. So once you have your, and I'm going to again practice on this little piece here. When you have your design and it's cut out and ready to go, you're going to line up the design with the piece for the body of your character where you want to sew it. So I'm going to start again. I already have my thread knotted and ready to go on here. Make sure that my piece is exactly where I want it to be attached. I'm going to take my needle and start on the back, so that ugly knot that I've made is going to be on the back of my felt, which will mean it's on the inside of my character and no one will see it later. So if I'm sewing a shape on and I want to do this stitch that stays on top of my design, I'm going to make sure that I'm moving around, up through the back, down through the front. I'm going to make sure that I'm moving around my design, and I want to stay a slight bit in from the edge. I don't want to sew right against the edge, but kind of close. Up through the back, down through the front, and I'm going to make sure that I'm going through both layers of my felt and evenly spacing those lines. I'm going to put this back in here, up through the back, down through the front, making my way around the design. So if I'm doing it this way, it's going to stay on top of my design all the way around, and that's one look. Points wise, I don't care which one you choose to do, the ones that stay on top, the ones that radiate out, if you want to do a combination of, as long as your stitches are nice and evenly spaced. So I'm going to show on this same piece on the other side here how to do the radiating running stitch. So once again, my needle comes up through the back. Now instead of going down through the front on top of the shape, I'm going to go straight out from where I came up, and I'm going to go down off my shape. I'm going to come back up on the shape and go down through the front, off the shape. So I'm going to come up through the shape, down, off the shape. And I would just continue this all the way around until my shape is completely sewn down to my character, so that I know that it's nice and secure and it's not going to come off. So once again, either way of doing the running stitch is fine with me. It's just a matter of which design you like. Do you want it to look more patch-like? Do you want it to look more streamlined? It's your design, you choose. Just keep the stitches nice, evenly spaced, and evenly sized for the neatest looking sewing job. Now again, once I get to the end of my shape, I can't just cut my thread. I want to end on the back. So I'm going to flip it over, and the back's going to look like a big old mess, and that's totally fine. I'm going to go underneath one of the loops. So I just chose this one because it's the closest with my needle. And before I pull it all the way tight, go through the loop it's making. And I do it 2 times to make a knot, 3 times if you're like me and you want to be extra safe. And then cut. And depending on which way you chose to sew, your shape is totally attached to your character. So you'll continue sewing all of the pieces onto your character, making sure that you're not sewing anything that's extending over the edges.